Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Mary, for that wonderful introduction. I'll just say a couple of more things about the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. You may know that we're comprised of more than 20 departments, programs, centers, and schools. And we also have about 28,000 alumni globally. And for that, we are very grateful and excited to be joining with many of you today here in the audience and virtually. We also have about 2,200 students who are majors, undergraduate majors in our college, and nearly 300 who are graduate students within the college. So we're quite proud of being so large and also making a large impact both here at DU and within the communities we are connected to. Now for a little background on why we're here tonight. The annual John Livingston Endowed Lecture series invites a cause faculty member, that's the acronym for our college, to present their work to the broader community. The late Professor John Livingston was an esteemed professor of history and chair of the department. He was not only a colleague, but a dear friend to many DU staff, faculty, and students who had the pleasure of working with him across their time here. This lecture series honors not only John, but his wife, Nancy. Those who knew and worked with John knew that theirs was a true partnership. He and Nancy came up with the idea for this lecture series when he was ill, and they were thinking of a way to honor his legacy at DU. Nancy is here with us tonight. For years, she has continued to carry forward his academic legacy by being an active member of the community and helping us with this wonderful lecture series. Thank you so much, Nancy. And now I'd like to introduce our esteemed speaker for tonight. We are honored to have with us tonight Dr. Esteban Gómez, Assistant Professor of Anthropology here at the University of Denver. Professor Gómez's current research focuses on producing pluralistic histories that are inclusive of groups and peoples whose pasts have been excluded and or marginalized from larger national narratives, and we will hear specifically about that work tonight. Professor Gómez is a visual ethnographer and curator in the Department of Anthropology. He was the co-host for season 1 of Sapiens, a podcast for everything human. Professor Gómez received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. Prior to his time at DU, he taught in the Department of Anthropology at Colorado College. He has done archaeological research in Central America and is currently doing ethnographic research on the educational and environmental problems affecting youth and established residents in Denver's gentrified neighborhoods. Professor Esteban Gómez will be joined a little bit later in the program by our Senior Associate Dean for Cause, Dr. Andrea Stanton, who will be moderating the question and answer portion of tonight's program. Welcome, Professor Gómez, to the stage.
Thank you for the introduction. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the indigenous people of the broader Denver area in Colorado. We honor and acknowledge that we are on traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations. This area was also the site of trade, hunting, gathering, and healing for many other Native nations: the Lakota, Ute, Kiowa, Comanche, Apache, Shoshone, and others. We respect the many diverse indigenous people still connected to this land on which we gather. We pay our respect to them and give thanks to all tribal nations and the ancestors of this place. I'd like to thank everyone who made this lecture possible. Nancy Livingston for endowing the series that honors Dr. John Livingston. Dean Rondo Gonzalez for the invitation to give the lecture. Aaron, Chris, Tremaine, and everyone else in advanced in planning, Laura in communications. And of course you, the audience, for spending your evening with us here at the University of Denver. And those for you who are also remote. We greatly appreciate your interest in the lecture and your support. So thank you very much. I also want to thank my research team, Dr. Alfredo Huante, a former IRISE postdoctoral fellow here at the University of Denver, and now a chancellor's postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Los Angeles. 2 undergraduate assistants, Walker Shomack Bailey and Robin Hollis, and recent DU grad Alejandra Caballero. This research has been supported by IRISE, the Interdisciplinary Research Institute for Study of Inequality, the University of Denver's Faculty Research Fund, the Center for Community Engagement to Advance Scholarship and Learning, the Arts and Society grant from Redline, and logistical support from the faculty and staff at North High School. Without them, this research would not have been possible. So much of this research involves the intersection between housing, education, and transportation. I wanted to think about gentrification here as not having a single cause, but multiple factors that go into it. And to think of the research as kind of being interdisciplinary, meaning that it involves research from urban studies, education, the arts, geography and transit, public policy, and the sociology of housing, as well as anthropology. I want to stress that the talk will be done in 3 acts. The first part, I'll focus on how I got involved in this research in the first place. Act 2, I'll talk about current research, and then Act 3, I'll go into future considerations. So kind of think of it as past, present, and future. So Act 1, I remember when. And yes, for those who are keeping score at home, I Remember When is a song title from the album Hanging Tough, released by New Kids on the Block in 1988. So yeah, you're welcome. If you're gonna use a No Kids on the Block kind of title for your lecture, you gotta throw in some New Kids on the Block here and there. So in 2008, I partnered with Tribal Zyphers, founded by Michael Acuna, AKA Acuna Black, and David Williams, AKA Fat Track. Acuna Black is an activist, spoken word artist, and the 2018 Westward Mastermind Award winner. Fat Track is a professional music producer, and if you like kombucha, you'll probably saw them featured on a commercial for Kavita. With support from Tribal Zyphers and students at the University of Denver, we coordinated a series of workshops with 27 students in Michelle Dame's photography class at North High School. The workshops were framed around a simple question. What kinds of stories can young people tell if they write about their neighborhoods using the memories of established residents? Students were tasked with producing short-form documentaries featuring spoken word poetry to comment on the educational and environmental problems affecting youth and its most established residents here in the city of Denver. Issues of power, youth voice, storytelling, and civic engagement were central to this educational project. My desire to work with youth stemmed from an upsurge in student protest movements in the past decade. High school students from around the country marked their identification and solidarity with student activism through circulation of messages and hashtags. While young people are familiar with national news, they're not as familiar with the particulars of related local news stories or city policies unfolding in their own neighborhoods. This is My Denver was designed to explore the complicated layers of what makes a place home through multimodal workshops that emphasize storytelling through spoken word poetry, musical production, and filmmaking. The workshops introduce teenagers to statistics on displacement and memories of Northside Denver's storied landscape. Both angles allow them to learn about the history of their community and the tools to understand how it has changed since the early 1990s. Visual stories, when informed by poetry and music, have the power to educate communities, stimulate a response, change opinions, and inspire people to act. Because the project was scheduled to be completed in the spring of 2020, essentially the beginning of the pandemic, we were never able to finish the film projects. Students were able to research the topics, produce music, write stories, and do oral history interviews, but they were never able to put it all together. We did produce some music though, and for those who arrived early, the music you heard was written and composed by the students, produced by Fat Track, and performed by Acuna Black. Also, the original concept for many of the slides in this presentation were initially conceived in those workshops. The logo for This Is My Denver was created by Scott McCormick with input from students. My goal is to return in the spring of 2022 to work with some of the students from those workshops but this time in a creative writing class at North High School. I chose to partner with an existing class because of the work and travel related challenges many students have attending, after school programs. A majority of students work low paying jobs immediately after school to help with family finances, or they have to commute for over an hour to get back home. One student in particular was not only a single mother, but also the manager of a nearby Burger King. She was the kind of student that I wanted to participate in these workshops. It was also important to have students from DU serve as mentors for their film projects. It gave students from North an opportunity to ask students from DU questions about university life. The goal was to demystify what it means to be a university student. At the same time, it's important for students at DU to better understand what it means to be a high school age student in a rapidly changing city like Denver. We can teach as many classes as we want about displacement, but it will always remain in the abstract if you have not experienced eviction on yourself or have been exposed to those stories on a personal level. And also on a side note, we did a similar program at Abraham Lincoln High School. One of the students, having worked with the DU students from the school, he was about to graduate, hadn't thought about DU as an opportunity. After those workshops, ended up applying and got a full ride here at DU and just graduated this past spring. So I thought it was important to have DU mentors working with these high school students. The core objective behind the workshops was the belief in engaging high school students as the experts of their own lived experiences, and to recognize young adults as competent social actors who play active roles in the shaping of their daily lives with important insights from which we can learn. The workshops began with the mapping exercise. Students were initially asked to draw a map of their neighborhood and to include places where they like to spend time or grab a bite to eat and other significant landmarks meaningful to them. Their maps had to include a 7-word story and photographs about their relationship with their neighborhood. Immediately, students asked the following question: which one? Where I live now or where I grew up? For those students displaced by the rising rents and loss of jobs, many of their stories and photographs express feelings of grief, either for a lost home, familiar social networks, or meeting places reserved for family and friends. These changes were so profound that they demanded a reformulation of responses to everyday situations, not only in terms of just getting to school, but where they went for groceries or who could babysit their younger siblings while they were away. Displacement, understood strictly as spatial dislocation, tells us only half the story of the impacts rapid change and development have inflicted on the residents of Northwest Denver. For those students who remained in the neighborhood, the loss of shops, neighbors, and family members initiated a change in how they fit in their new neighborhood structure, basically their place identity. The changes contributed to a loss of stability and control, similar to those who were displaced. In later workshops, using information gathered from their interviews with older residents, many of their creative works focus on ways in which their neighborhoods have changed and how they've been directly impacted by these changes. Some of their creative works focus on quantitative changes. For example, in one of the workshops, we focus on how the city measures gentrification, specifically changes in education, income, and home values in a neighborhood. In this example, students were working with media household income data in Northwest Denver. You can see here that between 1990 and 2000, there was a 24% increase in the income of residents in this area. Between 2000 and 2010, 74%. And then between 2010 and 2019, more than 30% in some areas, but in other parts of Northwest Denver, it was up to 50%. So you can see the rapid change. And so I thought it was helpful for the students to actually engage with a lot of this data. Other works looked at the impacts of the development and the simple but difficult task of just getting to school on time. In terms of development, a number of students specifically focused on the expansion of I-70, formerly known as the Central 70 project. In interviews with established residents and community leaders in the neighborhoods of Globeville and Elyria Swansea, many attributed the loss of businesses and income to the Central 70 project. In conversations with City Councilwoman Candy Vaca, she suggested that business closures were exacerbated by the recent pandemic, but that the process started with the initiation of the Central 70 project. This needs to be explored in more depth, but there are many examples where infrastructure has had significant economic and health impacts on low and middle income communities, which are often communities of color. In the workshops, we use this as an opportunity to discuss how highways have become the most noxious monuments to segregation in the country. We label these workshops as the architecture of inequality. One of the students summed up the impacts of highways in one succinct passage. Our toxic exhaust fumes feed into a pot of racism that's been stewing for nearly a century. Since the passing of the 1944 Federal Aid Highway Act, highways have been used to destroy racially diverse communities like Sugar Hill or Boyle Heights in the Los Angeles area, or serve as architectural barriers between communities. In Denver, we are quite familiar with this practice, as evidenced by the development of the Auraria campus, Santa Fe Drive, 6th Avenue, and the D line in 5 Points, just to name a few. Developers and city planners will acknowledge that many of these large infrastructure projects might inconvenience a few, but that we need to consider what's best for the city in the long run. Unfortunately, it's often low-income communities, mostly of color, that have historically carried the burden. The creative works produced by the students also focus on the task of just getting to school. In the enrollment data, it may seem like many of the students reside in the school boundary for North, but many of them use an address of a close relative to ensure that they get enrolled at North, their first priority. But as you can see with this map, students are traveling long distances and having to deal with traffic just to get to school. So for many of them, it takes about an hour to 2 hours just to get to school on time. But the idea of enrolling their children or making sure that their children have first priority to that school, that's a common strategy many families have used before. But this is something you might see a family do to enroll their child in a high-achieving, affluent, and generally white school. When it comes to testing, a measure many families use to determine where they would like to send their child for an education, North High School is placed in the bottom 50% of all schools in Colorado. So why do students choose to continue their schooling at North? School rankings play little to no role in the decision-making process. The positive or negative aspects of the school itself are not as essential to the sense of attachment as the comfort of being around those who share similar values, past experiences, and visions for the future. It is the particular interactions and experience at North that create the sense of attachment. This sense of attachment to their peers and their community at North far outweighed the negative consequences of longer commute times, such as less time spent sleeping, exercising, time with their respective families, and less time enjoying the life of a teenager. As one student noted, North was the only stable thing going for her. It was the only thing she could control. For students residing outside of the district, they face an impossible dilemma: long distances and travel times to the original schools, or neighborhood schools with less resources, and the intended negative effects of social and physical isolation from their original communities. Based on a study undertaken by Patrick Denise and Bethany Gross, students who take advantage of school choice will generally travel longer and find schools with better academic performance, student behavior, and educational opportunities than schools closer to their homes. This is definitely the case for students who have been displaced, but also something families have done to ensure their child does not attend the school in their gentrified neighborhood, which I'll discuss more in Act 2. The students and families that participate in this project love Denver. It's undeniable. They love the diversity of food options, the arts and culture, all the different kinds of things that make this city dynamic, a great place to live, and attractive to those looking for opportunity. They know there's a demand to live here, that a bunch of different kinds of people are trying to move here. They also understand that cities change, they need to grow. They just wish that growth did not have to come at their expense. Act 2, don't give up on me. If you happen to be near the new Zia apartment complex in Sunnyside on a weeknight, you might see a 40-something-year-old dude racing a 3-year-old down a sidewalk. It's not a fair race, to be honest. The old guy can barely keep up. His knees hurt, his hips are stiff, and he gets winded after a few feet of running. He feels like the old guy on the block. But nothing makes them feel older than being the grumpy resident yelling at the kids to keep their electric scooters off the sidewalk in front of his house. If there was an object that best signified a change to the neighborhood after the completion of the Zia complex with its 400+ units, it was the electric scooter. You can't stand them. No reason really, it's just maybe he's just jealous, who knows? After one of those walks through the neighborhood, Malia, my wife, got curious and looked at one of the townhouses on Zillow. She was mostly curious about the price, which is something we like to do. We're not real estate tycoons or anything like that, but I think this is probably the closest we'll ever be to being host on the HGTV show or something like that. So it's something that we do on occasion. But here you'll see the Railhouse Townhouse, just opened up next to the 41st and Fox Station. And you'll notice that there are two schools on this listing. The elementary school is Tre Vista and the middle school is Strive. What caught our attention was that for the middle school, it was Strive and not Tre Vista, even though at the time we thought that Tre Vista also offered middle school classes. But this generally got us kind of wondering about, where families are where do incoming families send their children for school? Across the country, the most visible and influential school rating system in America comes from the nonprofit Great Schools, whose 1 to 10 ratings appear in home listings on national real estate websites, Zillow, Realtor.com, and Redfin. Great Schools' stated mission is to help all parents, especially those who are low income, make informed decisions about where to send their children to school. According to a study done by Chalkbeat, Great Schools ratings effectively penalize schools that serve largely low-income students and those serving largely Black and Latinx students, generally giving them significantly lower ratings than schools serving more affluent and more white and Asian students. And yet, according to Great Schools' own data, many schools serving low-income Black and Latinx populations are doing a good job helping students learn math and English. But those schools still face long odds of getting an above average rating on Great Schools, likely because their students are arriving far behind. So if you'll see here with Knapp Elementary School, it gets a 9 out of 10 with student progress, which basically means they're doing really well teaching the kids math and English. But overall, it gets a 6 out of 10 because of the scoring. The result is a privately run school rating system that is steering people away from schools that serve low-income Black and Latinx populations and toward wider, more affluent schools. In Denver, areas with highly rated schools saw increases in home prices and rises in the number of white, Asian, and better educated families. Property values in those areas increased by nearly $7,000, making it more difficult for low-income families to buy into those areas, something we refer to as exclusionary displacement, meaning that certain families can't move into those neighborhoods because they can't afford it. It should also be no surprise that the school boundaries for those affluent schools have not changed since the 1970s. As a result, DPS has become one of the most segregated school systems in the country, as the chart on the right suggests. And to be honest, we should not be surprised by this. We've seen this movie before. This is a historic enrollment map with the numbers of students in schools in the district. You can see a drop-off in enrollment starting in the 1970s when forced busing is first introduced. And then enrollment spikes up again in the mid-1990s when forced busing ends and school choice is first introduced. But let me go back to Great Schools for a moment to show you how it steers families away from predominantly Black and Latinx schools. In this image, you'll see three things. First, the astronomical price for a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house. And even more absurd is that it's a pretty reasonable price when you compare that price to other houses with similar specs in other neighborhoods. Second, in the description, you'll see how they're selling the neighborhood for the house. While the 41st and Fox Station is only 3 blocks away, it never comes up in the description. Instead, they want you to know how many breweries and restaurants are in the neighborhood. Third, the elementary school listed for this house is Bryant Webster, which is located half a mile away from the school or from that house, even though Tre Vista is basically across the street. With school choice, families have the ability to send their child to any school in the district if there's room, but they have first priority to attend the school located in their boundary zone. I should also note that the house is located right across the street from Quig Newton, a public housing complex. I'll get to that in just a bit. Now, this is an egregious example, but it highlights several things. First, when a transit station first opens up in a neighborhood, property values in that neighborhood will skyrocket. Here are two examples of homes that were recently sold across the street from our home. This house was built in 1903, sold for $349, and then flipped and sold again for $670. That's basically a 92% increase. This house was built in the 1900s, sold for $315. They added a couple of rooms, maybe a room or two and a bathroom, and sold it again for $950,000. That's a 228% increase. This is basically called perspection. What's curious is that in a review of listings from this past month on Zillow, light rail rarely comes up in the neighborhood description for homes that are sold in this near the station itself. People are not moving to this neighborhood for transit. They're moving to this neighborhood for other amenities, like because it's close to a freeway or something like that. Realtors know that transit will bump up the price, but they are also not as concerned about featuring transit as a key amenity. Second, Bryant Webster was the main elementary school focused on the listing for this neighborhood, not Trevista. And I think there are two reasons for this. One, it's located next to Quig Newton, the public housing complex. And two, it has a higher number of Black students. In this case, 82-1. And based on the numbers, the higher the share in Black students, the lower the enrollment. The lower the enrollment, the lower the financial resources the school receives. And you guessed it, the higher the percentage of Black students, the lower the real estate value of those homes in that neighborhood. Essentially, this leaves them open to be eventually flipped by those willing to spend more than $680,000 for a single family home here in Denver. This process became especially pronounced after the Great Recession, when many of the families living in these neighborhoods foreclosed on their homes. And once those new families moved into that neighborhood, if they have kids, they are choicing their children out of those neighborhoods and into schools that are essentially more white. This is choice out data between 2000 and 2020, looking at, areas that have been labeled as gentrified by the city. We call this place assimilation, basically where you're willing to move into a neighborhood knowing that it's not ideal, but that it will become more to your liking over time. This is exactly what happened in Southwest Denver, in the neighborhoods of Westwood, Athmar Park, Marlee, Ruby Hill, Harvey Park, and College View. After the Great Recession, these neighborhoods saw a 19% decrease in the number of owner-occupied units from 2000 to 2015. Many people lost their homes, and if they didn't lose their homes, they lost their jobs. As a consequence, these neighborhoods have dramatically changed in the past 5 years. It should come as no surprise then that 10 of the schools in this part of the city are in danger of closing because of low enrollment. But it points to a larger issue that was well phrased by my boy Ricardo on Instagram. He's not really my boy, but we have similar thoughts. For real though, there's white parents taking their children to BLM protest who refuse to take their children to the predominantly Black schools in their gentrified neighborhood. This is concerning. Hashtag Austin protests. Schools in transit and gentrified neighborhoods have been drastically impacted by low enrollment in the past 5 years. If you ask city officials and DPS administrators, they'll tell you that it's mostly due to low birth rates. More recently, they've acknowledged the impacts of development, and that certainly plays a significant role, as we saw with Southwest Denver. But let's take a closer look at the West Colfax corridor, another transit neighborhood. Since 2010, the number of children under the age of 10 in the West Colfax and Villa Park neighborhoods has increased by 5%. But all 4 of these schools located in these 2 neighborhoods are on the verge of being shut down because of low enrollment. When you look at boundary of 10 data for these schools, boundary 10 meaning families that live in that school boundary zone, they have some of the lowest numbers for the district. I don't think we're seeing low birth rates here. And if you look at this chart here on the right, you'll see a higher or lower percentage of students or a lower percentage of families sending their kids to those schools. And on the left, you'll see that those are the more affluent schools and a high percentage of boundary attendance. When you look at boundary 10 data for these, but in terms of the West Colfax and Villa Park neighborhoods, Do you want to know which demographic group has shown the biggest gains in this neighborhood? You guessed it. People who were born during peak New Kids on the Block. I'm not sure how that worked out, but I guess you got to point it out, right? When the topic of school closure comes up, it's usually assumed that it's based on low performance or bad teaching. That's simply not the case. For example, Cal Elementary is on the school closure list for EPS, but it scores really well on grade schools, especially when it comes to student progress. The same can be said for Colfax Elementary. Students are entering the school at a lower level, but keeping up with their peers when it comes to testing. So what gives? Well, for one, both are located in a transit neighborhood that has experienced significant amount of displacement of low-income families, mostly Latinx, but it's more than that. The argument over school of choice is only the latest chapter in a decades-long political struggle between two models of freedom, one based on market choice and the other based on democratic participation. Market choice advocates often assume that organizing public spaces like a market must lead to beneficial outcomes. But in doing so, advocates of school of choice ignore the political ramifications of the marketization of shared goods like an educational system. The first point to consider when weighing whether or not to marketize the public school system is that markets always have winners and losers. In the private sector, the role of competition is often positive. For example, Friendster, the early reigning king of social networks, failed to create a format that people found as useful and attractive as Facebook. The result was that it eventually vanished. When businesses like Friendster fail, no significant public damage is done. Unless, of course, you consider the spread of misinformation on Facebook that led to Trump's victory in 2016 and the continued reluctance of vaccines from a certain segment of our population as significant public damage. But in most cases, it is arguably a salutary form of what the economist Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction, which is a feature of market innovation. But should all goods in a society be subjected to the forces of creative destruction? What happens to a community when its public schools are defunded or closed because they could not compete in a marketized environment? Or when they have to account for digitization scores like the ones offered by grade schools that have steered families away from ethnic and economically diverse neighborhoods? Act 3, where do I go from here? To be honest, I don't consider myself a critic of transit. I love transit. Actually, if I can take transit every day, I could. It's one of the reasons we decided to move to Sunnyside. Benjamin, my son, also loves transit. He's also the one that keeps beating me in those races. If possible, he'd spend the entire day on the G line. But it's clear that when transit-oriented development is placed near city downtowns, the likelihood of displacement becomes more pronounced. Park and rides located farther away from downtown centers are not as impactful when it comes to displacement. The same can be said for housing units built around transit when said development is planned farther away from the city core. The increase in rents, home values, and property values are just not as significant. And here's a map of those transit stations where we see significant change. I also recognize that we need more housing in the city, especially affordable housing. Since 2000, for every 3 people that have moved to Denver, only 1 unit of housing has been introduced. We have a supply problem. And until recently, Congress and previous national level administrations have never really been interested in intervening on the supply side of our housing problem. To them, it's a local issue that needs to be addressed by local actors. The US government likes to give people money like housing vouchers or a child tax credit to solve these kinds of problems. Giving money to fix the problem is an appealing solution because there's a direct beneficiary, you, the consumer. If the government were to decide that we need to build more homes, there's not a direct beneficiary. And it could take 4 to 6 years to address the supply side of housing. And that's not going to happen during an election year. And when you're trying to convince people to vote for you for your agenda and your party, it just takes too long to materialize. So they've basically left it to the states and local entities to figure it out. When you see housing supply drop precipitously, the likelihood of homelessness in your city or neighborhood increases dramatically. All you need to do is drive through Cap Hill, 5 Points, Globeville, and Sun Valley to see that homelessness has risen. In 2020, there were more than 24,000 homeless students in Colorado, a 30% increase from 2010. If you do not provide enough homes for people to live in, there will be people who still want to live in that area, whether it's because of their jobs or family or school, and they won't have a place to live. And if you make it more expensive, people aren't going to move to some rural location where there are no jobs because it's still not affordable for them to do so. If there's nowhere for them to pay affordable rents, they're going to remain concentrated in these urban environments. Making the situation more complicated are the zoning laws restricting the amount of supply we can provide for the city. There's basically a lack of density. In Denver, more than 85% of residential housing is zoned for single unit housing. There aren't many spaces where you can build. If you can introduce affordable housing, it's rarely done in the more affluent parts of the city, as the map here indicates. The city officials and politicians are saying things like housing is a human right, or that housing affordability is at the top of their minds, but they're not addressing supply-related issues like increased affordable housing or zoning reform or implementing anti-displacement strategies that come with development. Then they're lying to themselves or to the public. It's in this context that I've been keeping a close eye on the intersection between education and housing. And I've been also paying close attention to what's taking place in Park Hill, specifically at the Park Hill Golf Course. For those who have not been paying too close attention to this issue, you'll be voting on it next month with initiated ordinances 301 and 302. At 155 acres, the empty plot of land in North Denver rivals the size of Washington Park. It's one of the last undeveloped properties within city limits, and the land is protected by a conservation easement. For the sake of time, I don't want to get into the specifics of the easement itself, but they are generally used to protect land with conservation values, such as wildlife habitat, water rights, or special views. Understandably, the property has become a massive draw for green space advocates. They've organized into a group called Save Open Space Denver and are doing everything in their power to keep the land undeveloped. Westside Investment Partners, a developer whose work at the Loretto Heights campus is already known to many who live in Southwest Denver, bought the land in 2019 with the intention of lifting the conservation easement through a deal with the city. Opponents accuse Westside of supporting the bottom line at the cost of the city's open space and using PR stunts to get on the community's good side. For example, Westside recently included the Hollering Group, a team of African-American real estate developers, brokers, financial, and community relations professionals as a partner for the project. SOS Denver, on the other hand, has been accused of pushing a catchy agenda while ignoring the needs and voices of the historically marginalized Northeast Park Hill neighborhood. Both sides have powerful community players and longtime residents on their side. According to a number of sources that I've spoken to, SOS Denver has received a significant amount of monetary support from residents in the more affluent neighborhoods of South Park Hill, sorry. I haven't had the time to explore this more deeply, but it's something I'll be looking into. But they're pulling out all the stops using lawsuits, ballot measures, public steering committees, and community surveys to support their agendas. When it comes to development projects like this, it's important to ask what the community wants. In early 2021, Westside launched a community outreach project in coordination with the Park Hill Golf Course Steering Committee. Most of the community's responses pointed towards support of a mixed-use development that includes affordable housing. Residents also expressed concern for displacement and whether or not Westside and the city will set aside an adequate amount of affordable housing in the project. Overall, the survey revealed a desire for a blend of green space and development, which Westside is promising, but that too has generated a fair amount of controversy. We just don't know how much they're willing to accommodate. The disagreement over how to use the land isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening in neighborhoods. The three neighborhoods that make up Park Hill, especially Northeast Park Hill, experienced drastic white flight after Black families moved in after World War II. And the fleeing white families took property values and tax dollars with them. Even today, South Park Hill is wealthy and overwhelmingly white, with Northeast Park Hill, while Northeast Park Hill is predominantly low income and has a large Black population. And now, as North Northeast Park Hill becomes more expensive along with the rest of Denver, Black residents are moving away. The neighborhood has also lost numerous Black-owned businesses over the last 2 decades, including community centers like the Holly Shopping Center and the Dahlia. In an interview with Westward, Carol Watkins-Alley, and longtime Park Hill resident, said, developing Park Hill Golf Course gives the neighborhood the opportunity to have this as a center of commerce for the African-American community, which does not exist now. Given the history of the neighborhood, some longtime residents think that SOS Denver's ballot initiative, which asked the entire city to vote on whether to lift in conservation easement, is unfair. Historically, people in the areas near the golf course have had less say about the future of their own neighborhoods because of redlining, discriminatory housing practices, and the impacts of systemic racism. Having the city vote on an issue concerning Northeast Park Hill would just be one more instance of taking away their agency. At the same time, there has historically been a lack of green space in neighborhoods with a high percentage of Black residents. In the center of this debate are different perceptions of sustainability. What does it mean to live in a sustainable city? It's a question I keep asking myself and to different parties involved in this battle. We need more affordable housing. We also need to preserve open space whenever we can, when possible. At the same time, who are the hidden actors funding each of these initiatives? And what are their main priorities? And so these are some of the questions that I've been keeping in mind when looking at this situation. And at the moment, I don't think we have any clear answers on these questions. At this moment, I'd like for those who are online virtually, if you want to prepare any questions, we're nearing the conclusion of this lecture. In terms of conclusion, I didn't write out anything because I still don't know what to think of this situation with Northeast Park Hill. But I did write down some notes in terms of how to kind of tie all this together. In terms of all 3 acts, in terms of the school choice issues that we were confronting, and also the lack of affordability and taking care of our open space, I think these are serious questions that we need to keep in mind. With regards to school choice, I think DPS is recognizing the impacts of development, or at least doing a better job of recognizing those impacts. And also recognizing that school closures don't really do any good, right? And recognizing that, again, school closures doesn't mean it's a result of bad teaching or students wanting to leave that place. There are other factors to keep in mind. In terms of development, I think in the past 15 years, developers have kind of learned how their work has impacted local communities and have done a better job of working with the city to implement anti-displacement strategies. But at the same time, whether you build a park or build affordable housing or multi-use complex in the Northeast Park Hill Golf Course, people are still going to be displaced. People gravitate towards parks and towards multi-use spaces. But I think the question that I keep on asking myself, mostly because I'm a parent and I have a kid and I'm invested in this, what does it mean to live in a sustainable city in terms of looking at the impacts of transit-oriented development? Again, like I said, I'm a big fan of TOD. I think transit is a more efficient way of travel. There are a lot of benefits to it, but I also recognize the impacts of the development and housing that goes around transit. At the same time, making sure that we conserve green space. So in terms of the initiatives 301, 302, I'm still kind of undecided on that. But overall, I've learned a lot through this process in terms of working with high school students, looking at the impacts of TOD on local neighborhoods, as well as how do we think about living, what do we are concerned with regards to living in a sustainable city. Yeah, this is when I first started this work, this is not something I planned to do. I thought I was just going to do a youth project with high school students, but here I am doing, looking at sustainability issues. So thank you very much.
So I'm Andrea Stanton. I'm the Senior Associate Dean, and it is my great pleasure to first thank Esteban for that really critically framed, very interesting, and also quite sobering talk. Right now, I would like to invite members of our in-person and remote audience to pose questions. I think we have about 10 minutes for Q&A before we'll wrap up. I think I'm looking at the screen to see if there's questions in the chat. There we go. And then we will have a couple of folks who can walk around with microphones, our colleagues Erin and Laura, to take questions in person. I'm regrettably not quite as tall as this microphone would like me to be, so I'm just going to move that. I'm not seeing anything come in on the chat yet, which may be my error. So maybe if we have an in-person question, we could start with that.
I'm not quite sure how to phrase the question, but I just want to say thank you for following what people asked you to do and where the trail led you. I live in the West Colfax neighborhood. I'm going to an equity meeting. A bunch of my colleagues on that meeting who are working with Villa Park too tried to get online, but I don't think that they got a link. But we're really grateful that you're looking at all of these things together. And I have been in my head all day about, I'm an urban planner. I'm trained in planning. I'm trained in sustainability science, but I frame my work around regenerative design and development. And there's the 3E model of sustainability that's like central to the way that planners think about sustainability. And it presents the conflicts that you so perfectly articulated about the Park Hill golf course, where you have clear environmentalists who aren't really working with the housing equity folks, and then you've got a developer. And like, you know who's gonna win? Like, it's
Right.
like pretty freaking obvious. But the conservation easement, and conservation is a really freaking racist word.
Mhm.
And I struggle with that because I'm an environmentalist and ecologist. But I talked to some of them, and like, they are so committed and they mean so well, but they have a very exclusionary approach to their language and their organizing, and they're not working with the housing folks. But that is the way the system is designed, because the 3Es are not equity and economy and environment. They're extraction, exclusion, and exploitation. And that's what's driving the whole system.
Great. And I so appreciate all your comments. Just in the interest of time,
thank
maybe
you.
we can
I'm so
just
sorry.
ask
So
Esteban to
I
comment.
guess the question is there a way that you are sensing from who you've talked to that there could be a paradigm shift with that beautiful big piece of land that is a commons? And is there a way that there could be a conversation to rethink that?
Is there a way, sorry, what was that last part?
A way to have a conversation using your art, using your stories, using the community connections that you have to host a conversation that's different. Because I'm not going to vote on either of those things because they're depressing to me. And there's no right answer. And I don't know, like there's got to be another way forward. And I'm curious what's been showing up for you underneath the tensions.
Yeah, and I don't think there's any clear agreement. So I'm part of the Northwest Denver Steering Committee. So we meet on a monthly basis to talk about the future for Northwest Denver. And one of the questions I always ask is like, how do you envision, what's your vision for the future? And everybody has a different take on that, right? And everybody defines sustainability in different ways, right? And so I think whatever happens in Northeast Park Hill, I'm pretty sure that there has to be some type of mixed use that takes place there, I think that's what I think is going to happen, some type of mixed use. I'm not sure if it's going to be West Side or some other entity, but I think that some entity is going to create a mixed use space there. It's going to have some green space. I just don't know how much, and and even if whoever wins 301, 302, there's going to be counter ballots, counter initiatives, and counter lawsuits to go with it. And so I think building here in the US is very complicated. It's, takes more money, takes more time than in Europe and other parts of the world, right? So I don't know if there's an answer to your question, but I'd love to talk to you afterwards and get your perspectives on this, because I'm wondering, now I have another question. Were you born between 1988 and 1994? Oh, okay. Okay, all right.
So I'm going to take a question from our online audience next. And this question is about the Denver City Master Plan, for those of you who are familiar with that. And so the question is, in your view, how does the Denver City Master Plan respond or not respond to some of the concerns that you've articulated for us this evening?
Yeah, so the master plan for the city of Denver, again, that's part of the Northwest Steering Committee. It is for a more sustainable, more efficient city, right? And so with regards to what's going on in Northeast Park Hill, sorry, was that the question with regards to North?
The question is general, but
Okay.
it's yours to answer. So you may take it as it's you.
Yeah, I think, I think this is why the city wants to develop that space, is to, again, introduce more housing and also make the city more efficient. And so one of the things I forgot to mention with regards to the Northeast Park Hill plan is that it's located near a transit station, right? And so there's transit that's going to be built around there, or sorry, TOD that's going to be built around there. And the question is, do we need more TOD in that specific area? And so, yeah, I think the Northeast Park Hill project is going to align with that master plan in terms of what they want to take place.
Great, thank you. Shall we take another question from the audience? If not, I've got another one in the chat.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to ask you more about the transit part of it. I sense a lot of ambivalence from you about the role that transit is playing in terms of the change going on. And some of the data that you presented suggests that transit may not really be the catalyst or the driver behind a lot of the change. And I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that in terms of transit being just sort of a vehicle by which the change is happening rather than it being the true catalyst behind the change.
Yeah, I think with any type of gentrification research that you do, or looking at changes within a city, or whether that be on displacement or other changes that you might see in neighborhoods, when you look at the TOD state, or transit-oriented development that's placed near the city core, you see drastic changes within those neighborhoods. However, when TOD is placed farther away, or you have park and rides farther away from the city core, you see less impact, right? And so I think if developers are going to implement TOD near the city core, there has to be a number of strategies that they can implement to make sure that residents don't get displaced, or provide provide some other mechanism so that people are incentivized to stay there, or don't lose their homes. And at the same time, making sure that those new TOD development projects provide jobs and opportunities for those who are already in the neighborhood, right? So there's a number of strategies that can be used to make sure that the residents are taken care of. You can introduce like stabilization funds to make sure that you can do that. But yeah, I think based on what I've researched and what I've seen is that with TOD, the closer it is to downtown, the more impactful. And the farther away from the downtown, it's not as impactful.
Great, thank you. I think we'll take a question from the chat next. Okay. So this question is about Denver Public Schools, and going back to your comments in the presentation about the fact that the borders of Denver Public Schools have not been reevaluated or redrawn in decades, and that one of the impacts has been increasing segregation in the schools. And so the question is, how can redrawing these school districts help with some of the impacts and inequities that the current system has created?
Yeah, so actually this was in a conversation that I had with a enrollment analyst with DPS a couple of weeks ago in terms of redrawing some of those lines. I mean, the school choice it's here to stay. I mean, you can't erase school choice, and that would be rather impossible to get rid of it. So what are different strategies that can be used to redraw those lines so that you make it more equitable and may also make the schools a little bit more diverse. So DPS is looking into that in terms of making sure that, or redrawing those school boundary zones to try to make them less segregated.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Is there an audience in-person audience question that we could take before we close? Okay, well then in closing, let me just begin by thanking again Professor Esteban Gómez and all of you for attending, whether in person or virtually. And we'd also like to especially thank Nancy Livingston for making this night possible. I think that for us, this lecture is a great reminder of the importance of the arts, humanities, and the social sciences in our everyday lives. They are deeply relevant and help us better understand our world, the world we live in and the world we may create tomorrow. Just as a reminder, the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences strives to be the engine of cutting-edge research and artistic expression that drive exploration and intellectual stimulation on campus and in the community. Your support and engagement with our college provides our students the opportunity to deepen their learning experience and also to immerse themselves in projects that can truly change the world. So thank you again for coming out this evening or joining us online this evening to hearing one of our esteemed faculty in cause. It is such an honor for us to be able to highlight our great faculty colleagues in this way. We encourage all of you in the audience to continue to participate with the DU community in a variety of other activities. As you may know, this week is the celebration for the Chancellor's inauguration, and there are more activities that you can find at connected.du.edu, and you can also find more at homecoming.du.edu. So thank you very much again for attending. We hope that those of you who are here get home safely and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you again.